conversation about the social, legal, political context in which these declarations are released and the kind of role that they can play both in science and in policy. And just as a preview, my view is going to be that there is no single role for declarations or any other general kind of document or statement to make. Instead, there are a variety of roles that they can play, and probably we can make the most progress both in science and in policy when we have a kind of systems approach and we have more moderate statements and more radical statements bouncing off each other and disagreeing to some extent, reflecting different perspectives that exist in society, and more progress can be made in an ecosystem that includes both kinds of statement and the disagreements and tensions among them than in a context where everyone is doing one kind of work, either the moderate work or the radical work, relatively speaking. So starting with some context about the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, this declaration started to take shape in fall 2023 when Kristen Andrews from York University, Jonathan Birch from the London School of Economics, and I met at a conference at Princeton University. And we're talking about what we thought was an opportunity and maybe a responsibility for leaders in the space, either us or somebody else, to organize a current statement about the current state of science of animal consciousness. Because our general impression is that there is a lot of rapid progress happening in the science of animal consciousness and a lot of shifting understandings in terms of the scope of at least potential consciousness in the world and a responsibility to attend to welfare risks for potentially conscious non-human animals. And in conversations with people outside of the science of animal consciousness, including people in policy spaces, our impression is that they had a general sense that scientific opinion, scientific consensus was shifting, but they had no single clear, concise, accessible, authoritative document or statement that they could reference in order to confirm for themselves their sense that scientific opinion was shifting, or to cite for purposes of advocacy or policy or any other sort of change-making aspiration. And so we thought there was an opening to collect leading experts, especially in science, who work on a variety of taxa, and then go through a deliberative process with them where we could see over the course of many conversations via email, via Zoom calls, what kind of simple, clear, concise, accessible, authoritative statement everybody could endorse and sign. And then we might be able to release that. And even if that statement might not then reflect everything that I take to be true or everything that I think we should be doing, it could still represent a kind of shifting baseline in mainstream science. And a representation of that shifting baseline in mainstream science can still be really, really valuable for updating everybody else outside of this narrow scientific community about the current state and trajectory of the field, and make it a little bit easier for people interested in policy, for example, to cite a ready-made document that is kind of beyond reproach in terms of who the signatories are and what the statements are in the document. And then, of course, a side effects we hoped is that it could also spark a broader conversation of exactly this nature, like whether this declaration goes far enough and what future declarations might include, or where the field should go in general. And again, a little bit of foreshadowing. We've been pleased that to a significant extent that has been happening, and I hope it will continue to happen. So what then followed from that conversation in fall 2023 is that we contacted, again, leading experts primarily in the sciences as opposed to philosophy, even though our own disciplinary background is in philosophy, who represent research related to vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and then invertebrates of various kinds, cephalopod, mollusks, decapod crustaceans, insects. And over the course of several months of intensive conversation and negotiation, we landed on very carefully edited language that remarkably everyone who was in these conversations was able to enthusiastically endorse. And to be clear, there were many drafts, there were many objections, there were many concessions, compromises. There were attempts at stronger language that many people felt was premature given the current state of the science or given their own ethical commitments. There were attempts at more fine-grained language that then ended up receiving objections because the more fine-grained you make the categories, the more disagreement there is about which taxa belong in which categories. So what emerged from this long, painstaking process was, at least within this cohort of 40 or so initial signatories, fairly democratically produced statement that makes three basic claims. The first claim being that there is now strong scientific support for attributions of consciousness to mammals and birds. The second being that the empirical evidence now also supports at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in a much wider range of animals, and that includes all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and many invertebrates, including at minimum, and that at minimum language was very important, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, and insects, ants, bees, fruit flies. Now, to be clear, those taxa collectively include more than a quintillion individuals alive at any given time. So this is a truly very large number and diverse range of animals represented in this declaration. Oh, sorry, got to get my dog from the balcony.
Who is conscious?
Who is very, very conscious, yes. He is, in fact, quite likely to be conscious, according to the empirical evidence, according to the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness.
Yes.
And then the third claim was an ethical claim, which is that when there is at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in an animal, we have a responsibility to consider welfare risks for that animal when making decisions that affect them. So in other words, certainty of consciousness or even a probability of consciousness is not a requirement or expectation for basic moral consideration and mitigation of welfare risks. If there is a realistic possibility of consciousness in an animal, then there is a morally significant risk that merits consideration. And people who are making decisions that affect that animal have a responsibility to take reasonable, proportionate steps to consider and mitigate relevant welfare risks. Now, that is admittedly a fairly general ethical statement, compatible with various interpretations, some of which are stronger and more abolitionist regarding various uses of animals for food and research, other of which are more moderate and perhaps compatible with sufficient regulation for those animal use industries. But that was, for better or for worse, the short set of scientific and ethical commitments that everybody in the conversation could endorse. And so that ended up being the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. We then released this declaration in April 2024, and we were pleased that to some extent it did spark a really valuable conversation in society. It was covered by our count by hundreds of media outlets all across the world and in different countries and different languages. The coverage was almost universally, not entirely, of course, but almost universally credulous and positive, simply noting that scientists are telling society that more animals might be conscious than were previously thought, and we ought to extend consideration to them in the spirit of caution and humility. There were, of course, also critiques of the form the declaration should have included more taxa. It should have made stronger commitments about the probability of consciousness. It should have made stronger commitments about the need for urgent reform of animal use industries. As I will suggest in a moment, I think those critiques are very welcome and I think directionally correct. But our view as the organizers and initial signatories of the declaration was that the declaration is nevertheless valuable as a statement of emerging mainstream opinion in science and a kind of signal of perhaps the trajectory of science. So if the past decade has included the kind of expansion and the kind of emerging ethical commitment that you can see in the New York Declaration, then that might create a presumption that the next decade will then warrant further expansion towards still neglected taxa and perhaps stronger ethical commitments regarding animal use industries of various kinds, including scientific research. But the language reflected in the declaration was the language that could be endorsed by those researchers, those scientists. And our view remains that that kind of declaration with those sorts of commitments endorsed by those kinds of scientists is really valuable, both as a snapshot of where science is right now, and again, as a citable resource for people who are interested in asking what mainstream science has to say about this issue right now. Now, what
Right.
do I personally think about the issue? My own view is that a wider range of taxa are consciousness candidates, not only given the evidence currently available, but also given the scientific and ethical value of presuming consciousness rather than the absence of consciousness in the absence of evidence. My view
Mhm.
is also that we should, in fact, endorse basically ending most forms of animal use and especially invasive forms of animal use like factory farming and industrial animal agriculture and invasive and lethal animal research. And I have said that in my own personal capacity, in my academic scholarship, as well as in interviews and commentary surrounding the release of the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. When I did interviews related to the declaration. And when I was asked about the ethical and policy implications, I now had an opportunity to say, well, not speaking on behalf of the authors and signatories of the declaration, but I will say on my own behalf that I think as a society we ought to aspire to end factory farming and industrial animal agriculture and invasive and lethal animal research and so on and so forth. And with Kristen Andrews and Jonathan Birch, I have also continued to call for, yes, further research so that we can improve our understanding of animal consciousness, though, and I am not sure, Lori, if your introduction was in reference to us as the organizers, but I certainly am not trying to achieve consensus or certainty. I think consensus and certainty might be unavailable and might not be necessary for the kinds of reforms that we need. I do think further research would be necessary in order to improve our understanding and reduce our uncertainty about animal consciousness, both so we can refine our view of which animals merit which kinds of protections, and so we can refine our view of what kinds of protections they need and what it takes to treat them appropriately, given everything we know about them. But we have urged in a lot of our own publications and commentaries and interviews surrounding the declaration that once there is a realistic possibility of consciousness, or once there is genuine uncertainty or a lack of evidence about consciousness, then we, yes, should collect more information, but we should avoid, for example, the intentional infliction of pain and suffering on animals as part of that collection of information. So in particular, we have called for more observational research and more research involving positive affective states like indicators and markers of joy, both because that would be a less ethically problematic way of furthering our understanding of animal consciousness, and because it would be better scientifically too. It would help inform us about further dimensions of consciousness that a narrow focus on pain and suffering could easily lead us to overlook.
Yeah.
And so the status quo, in my view, is that we have a really nice new declaration that does show a shifting baseline in a way that is really useful for both science and for policy. And yes, that declaration is not ultimately, I think, going to stand the test of time as the final statement of where science and ethics should land. I hope and expect that it will be replaced by another uh, snapshot of changing views in mainstream science in 5 or 10 years. And in the meantime, today and next week and next month and next year, there will be other voices that are critiquing it and calling for it to go farther, exactly as Liv and others were doing in the immediate aftermath of the release of the declaration. And I think that is as it should be. We will make more progress over time in society if we have, again, this constellation, this system of activity with different actors playing different roles at different times. And it can help to have relatively moderate incrementalist work that can gradually shift the goalposts and bring us a little bit closer to eventual more radical or transformative changes. And it can be helpful to have more radical and transformative work that can shift the center of gravity and call for those further changes right now, and again, soften the ground, not only for more incremental change in the short term, but then for more transformative change in the long run. So from a scientific perspective, I think it helps to have those snapshots of different viewpoints, mainstream views, and then perhaps more radical views. And then from an ethical and policy perspective, I likewise think that it helps to have those different viewpoints, because they can play these different roles in a division of labor, and we can make more progress as a society over time if the moderates are shifting the goalpost, paving the way for radical change. If the radicals are shifting the center of gravity, making the moderates look more moderate in comparison, we can go farther as a society when that kind of dynamic is occurring. In this case, I felt we had an opportunity to facilitate a conversation among scientists who could play that moderate role. And then, a week later, I might write a paper about the need for a global ban on factory farming by 2050, or about the need to have significantly better ethical standards for non-human subjects research. So, different goals and different strategies at different times. But that is generally what we did and what my attitudes are about it. I will stop now, and I am very eager to hear what Liv has to say. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And, I didn't mean to suggest that you personally were calling for a consensus, but it's interesting. It's before I give Liv the floor, what you just said hits on all these important areas where, the concept of consensus, the concept of reasonableness, all of these have space. And so the question is, where do we land in that space? So thank you for a really informative talk. Well, I would like to now hand the floor over to Liv. Remember, everyone, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Liv Baker.
Great. I'm going to give people an option not to look at me if they don't want to, and instead, are you all able to see the image of the jumping spider?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So my what I'm going to share with you may be a little less short and a little less sweet. But yeah, so I just want to thank you, Lori, and many thanks to Lori and Kathy for the invitation to participate in this conversation, and thank you all for being here. I want to begin with a simple yet urgent question, which is, what is the purpose of declaring that animals are conscious? Declarations like the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness affirm what science, ethics, and lived experience have long confirmed, that many animals experience the world in ways that matter to them. But if these declarations do not demand change, if they do not call for the abolition of practices that deny animals the ability to live on their own terms, then what are they really doing? Because if the answer is nothing, or if they merely lead to minor refinements in how we exploit these beings, then these declarations do more harm than good. Rather than serving as catalysts for change, they become instruments of complicity. They acknowledge sentience while continuing to permit practices that violate it. They recognize the capacity for suffering while allowing suffering to persist. We see this contradiction everywhere. We acknowledge that pigs are cognitively and emotionally complex, yet we intensively confine them, deny them social relationships, and systematically kill them in slaughterhouses. We acknowledge that octopuses are intelligent, capable of problem solving, and experiencing distress, yet we are building octopus farms to mass produce them for human consumption. We acknowledge that monkeys and mice alike experience pain and fear and express empathy, yet we subject them to invasive experiments that inflict and violate precisely those experiences. These declarations do not disrupt human dominance over other beings, they reaffirm it. Recognition without protection is an endorsement of harm. The New York Declaration claims that when there is a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, we must not ignore that possibility. And yet, in practice, that is exactly what we do, constantly, institutionally, and often without consequence. We acknowledge that fishes feel pain, yet we drag them from the water to suffocate and cut them apart when they are fully aware. We acknowledge that elephants and other social animals build relationships and pass on cultural traditions, yet we isolate them in enclosures, severing the very connections that define their lives, breaking their family structures, their histories, and their ways of knowing their world. We acknowledge that primates and rodents experience complex emotions, yet we inject them with diseases, restrain them, and deprive them in laboratories of the control over their own bodies. We acknowledge that birds, reptiles, and even insects engage in sophisticated decision-making, yet we destroy the environments that support their ability to make choices at all. What these contradictions reveal is that recognition without action does not challenge harm, it sustains it. Instead of leading to the end of invasive research, captivity, and exploitation, these declarations provide ethical cover for these very same practices. They allow us to refine, to regulate, and perpetuate harm under the illusion of progress. If we are serious about animal consciousness, then we must be serious about what it demands of us. And that means challenging the systems that violate it, not rebranding them as more ethical or more ethically aware. It is not just pain we must reckon with, it is the theft of joy, the loss of meaningful choices, the silencing of voices in their own lives. It is the stripping away of exploration, curiosity, pleasure, play, and belonging. To recognize consciousness while refusing to respect what that consciousness makes possible, the relationships, the desires, the agency, the right to experience a full and rich life, is not recognition at all. It is a performance. Consciousness is not an isolated trait. It emerges from a network of knowing. If we are serious about recognizing animal consciousness, we must also change how we attempt to know it. For too long, the study of animal cognition has been reductionist, treating behaviors as discrete markers or indicators, rather than as expressions by whole animals of complex, integrated ways of knowing and being. A chimp passing the mirror test, a crow using a tool, a fish avoiding a noxious stimulus. Science too often reduces intelligence to singular demonstrations, focusing on whether an animal can pass a human design test instead of recognizing how intelligence manifests across the entirety of their lived experience. But cognition, like well-being, is not a simple measure. It is an emergent state, arising not from isolated behaviors, but from the dynamic interactions among environment, relationships, learning, and agency. Well-being, like consciousness, does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges through a network of interconnected dimensions. So this is why I actually developed what I call the spheres of well-being framework. And I hope you all can see it here. The spheres of well-being framework offers a structured approach that fundamentally shifts how we understand animal knowledge and expression. This framework challenges traditional scientific approaches and asks us to consider how animals perceive, know, and express themselves through their behavioral choices, not as isolated actions, but as demonstrations of complex integration among spatial knowledge, among memory, social awareness, anticipation, and individual preference, personality. Their understanding of and response to the world, these aren't compartmentalized, but exist as a unified way of knowing that informs every choice and interaction. So each sphere from environmental engagement to cultural transmission, from emotional expression to knowledge acquisition, influences and is influenced by the others, creating a dynamic system of experience and of expression. And so this transforms our approach to well-being assessment. So we must understand how animals themselves perceive and evaluate their own experiences, how they create meaning from their interactions, and how they understand themselves. So let's consider an animal's physical health and safety, how they experience and respond to bodily states and vulnerabilities, their environmental engagement, their ability to interact with and understand one's surroundings, their social connection and culture, their relationships, traditions, their shared knowledge that shape experience, their knowledge acquisition and learning, how their memory, their experience, and observation guide their decision making, and their emotional expression, how affective states shape and are shaped by lived experience, and self-determination and agency, their ability to make meaningful choices about their own lives. When we acknowledge that well-being arises through these interconnected dimensions, we must also recognize how our scientific and ethical frameworks fail to account for them. Instead of appreciating animals as whole beings, science often continues to impose narrow, human-centered standards, demanding that animals prove their intelligence, their emotions, their capacity for suffering and joy through tests designed for human expectations. And for many species, this burden of proof is impossibly high. The burden of proof is often on the animals, and that is a problem. But the problem runs deeper. These declarations also perpetuate and also reinforce scientific and moral poverty, one that demands animals constantly prove their worth. Acknowledging the past without perpetuating its harms is possible. Science does not exist in a moral vacuum. The knowledge we have today about animal cognition, about consciousness, behavior, has been shaped by histories of exploitation, colonization, and subjugation, both of human and non-human beings. The methods that built the foundations of ethology, psychology, and neuroscience have often been extractive, invasive, and dismissive of the autonomy of their subjects. To acknowledge this reality is not to excuse it. Recognition of this past does not grant us permission to be relativistic about the present, nor does it absolve us of responsibility for what comes next. Instead, it demands that we interrogate the frameworks that allowed such harm to be normalized and ensure that our continued pursuit of knowledge does not perpetuate the same cycles of complicity and complacency. We stand on ground that was shaped by systems of domination of both people and of animals. This awareness does not bind us to those systems. It compels us to dismantle them. To say that we benefit from knowledge obtained through unethical means is not an argument for perpetuating those means. It is a call to do better, to push science beyond its extractive traditions and toward a model that is rooted in respect, reciprocity, and ethical imagination. If we claim to be guided by truth, then we must recognize that truth-seeking cannot come at the cost of those whose lives we study. Ethical science is not an obstacle to progress. It is the only legitimate form of progress. We have demanded that animals prove their sentience, their cognitive complexity, their capacity for suffering, their social and emotional worlds again and again. And even as the declarations expand this recognition to include more beings, fishes, cephalopods, insects, they still reinforce the same flawed premise that only when science grants approval do these animals deserve moral standing. But this is not a pursuit of knowledge. This is a gatekeeping mechanism that serves human interests. And this is not just a failure of science, it is an ethical failure. To force other animals to prove their worth while we continue to harm them, regardless of the evidence, is not a pursuit of knowledge. It is an excuse to delay moral reckoning. Consciousness is not an abstract puzzle to be solved. It is an ethical demand. And yet we have treated it as if it is nothing more than an academic exercise rather than a call to action. Consciousness is an ethical demand, not an academic debate. This gatekeeping is a way of managing moral obligations rather than reckoning with them. It is a way of maintaining control over other beings by continuously raising the threshold for who counts. The failures of these declarations go beyond inaction. They limit our ethical imagination and actively exclude other beings from being known on their terms. And the species most often dismissed, the ones forced to clear the highest bar, are often invertebrates. So let's go back to this beautiful jumping spider. Let's think about jumping spiders, individuals that I've had the privilege to work with in my career. Jumping spiders plan routes in advance, adjusting their movements based on spatial reasoning, memory, and problem solving. They construct mental maps of their surroundings, choosing paths that bypass obstacles and reduce risk. Decisions that require foresight, not mere instinct. Now consider an elephant navigating a fragmented landscape. She pauses, she scents the air, she assesses the terrain. She is not just moving, she is deciding. She draws upon memory, social knowledge, past experience. She knows where she is, where she has been, and where she is going. These two species, a spider weighing a fraction of a gram, an elephant weighing thousands of kilograms, are both engaged in deliberate, self-determined decision-making in their lives. Neither species is engaged in a single cognitive act. Their decisions reflect a network of knowing shaped by memory, experience, and an understanding of self in relation to place, to time, and to others. Yet because spider cognition does not manifest in ways easily recognizable to us, it is largely excluded from conversations about consciousness. And because elephant intelligence has been so thoroughly documented, we often exploit it under the guise of admiration, placing them in enclosures, managing their movements, deciding for them when they will migrate, whom they will associate with, and what their futures will look like. If we want to know them, to truly know them, we need to be scientifically and ethically creative. We must move beyond extraction and toward scientific creativity. Understanding animal consciousness requires more than extracting knowledge. It requires a willingness to learn from animals in ways that do not distort them and that do not diminish them. This means seeing animals as agents of their own lives, not objects in controlled settings, but individuals shaping their own futures. It means developing non-invasive frameworks that allow us to observe them in natural, non-exploitative settings, respecting their autonomy rather than forcing them into artificial conditions. It means recognizing their intelligence on their terms, not ours. Understanding that awareness, problem solving, and decision making emerge through interaction with their environment and with others and with time. We already have ways to do this. There are ethical, non-invasive methods that allow us to study animals without reducing them to test subjects. But instead of prioritizing these approaches, we continue to justify harmful, outdated methods that strip animals of their autonomy in the name of research. If we are to claim to care about knowing these beings, then we must first recognize our ethical responsibility in how we come to know them. Being in right relation is a transformative ethical path forward. If declarations are to mean anything, they must move beyond recognition to right relation. Being in right relation means recognizing that animals are not objects of study, not resources to be managed, but sovereign beings, individuals with their own ways of knowing, their own communities, their own cultures. When we speak of elephant consciousness, it is not merely an abstract fact. It is a reality lived in social relationships, in cultural traditions, passed through across generations. in choices made about where to go, with whom to be, and how to move through their world. When we deprive them of these choices, we do not simply, quote, limit their welfare. We destroy their very ability to exist as themselves. And the same is true across species, whether it is fishes navigating the currents with generational knowledge, cephalopods solving problems through embodied intelligence, or insects communicating in complex social systems. Each of these beings inhabits a world rich with experience. To strip them of the ability to live within these worlds is to commit an ongoing and systemic violation. Declarations must demand more. Recognition alone is meaningless unless it translates into right action. If we truly understand consciousness as an ethical demand, then the next step is clear. We must take that recognition out of academic debates and policy papers and embed it into law, into protections, into the fundamental restructuring of how we interact with other beings. If declarations are to have any legitimacy, they must move beyond acknowledgement to abolition. They must integrate into law and policy. They must reject the exclusionary framework of human-defined thresholds. This is a moment of reckoning. Anything less is not progress, it is stagnation. We cannot continue pretending that small adjustments to exploitative systems are enough. We must choose between the comfort of half measures and the courage to fundamentally transform our relationship with other beings. This is a moment of reckoning. We must continue producing declarations that claim, we can continue producing declarations that claim to recognize animal consciousness while perpetuating the very systems that violate it, or we can demand more of science, more of policy, and more of ourselves. Because to acknowledge that another being is conscious while continuing to deny them their autonomy is not just ethically incoherent, it is morally and scientifically indefensible. Thank you for your time, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Liv. Thank you very much. We have a lot to discuss here, obviously. Thank you. There are a lot of interesting points here that are being made, and I think what we will do is, I have some points that I'd like to make about what you said, what Jeff said. Let me give Jeff an opportunity, if he'd like to respond to what you just said, and then we'll just get into a conversation. And meanwhile, we'll get the Q&A going as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you very much for those comments, Liv. As I said in my initial remarks, I am broadly sympathetic substantively with most, if not all, of what Liv said. My own personal views are much closer to what Liv said than, for example, the contours of the New York Declaration in and of itself. And again, in a lot of my surrounding work, I say more or less exactly that. I published a book a month ago called The Moral Circle, where I go beyond jumping spiders and I advocate for at least some moral consideration for microscopic organisms and even plants and fungi for broadly similar reasons. And so again, definitely agree on the substance. That was not even remotely a possibility for a declaration with these signatories at this time. And so, yes, the declaration that we released does limit itself to all vertebrates and then particular invertebrate taxa, cephalopod, mollusks, decapod, crustaceans, insects. And yes, it does not call for an end to factory farming or invasive animal research, but it does call for ethical consideration, mitigation of welfare risks. Now, that is broad enough, as I noted before, to encompass different and conflicting views about what appropriate, sufficient ethical consideration means in practice. It can encompass abolitionist views, it can encompass regulationist views. And so I think we can endorse the shifting baseline of the New York Declaration while then continuing to have those debates about what it means to give sufficient consideration and to have that reflected in advocacy and policy. And as part of those debates, I will take the side of the more abolitionist, more radical, more transformative policy goals, ending factory farming, ending industrial animal agriculture, ending invasive animal research. Though other people will take different stances, as Liv says, that might reflect a certain kind of tension, a certain kind of hypocrisy, a certain kind of contradiction in society, in mainstream science, even in mainstream ethics right now. But of course, that contradiction does exist in society, in mainstream science, in mainstream ethics. And if we can at least acknowledge and establish that there is a shifting baseline, that there now is widespread agreement of a realistic possibility of consciousness in insects, for example, in more than a quintillion individuals alive at any given time, that there is a responsibility to consider and mitigate welfare risks for them, then in my view, that does constitute progress over the previously established baseline of, nah, probably not any consciousness in them, probably not any need for any ethical consideration at all. Even lip service towards welfare interests in those species constitutes progress from where we were before. Now, where I disagree, and I'll end in a moment so we can take questions and so on. Where I disagree is just with one narrow claim made in Liv's remarks, which is that the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness does more harm than good. I disagree that it does more harm than good. I agree that it should go farther. I think that there should be more provocative declarations released today. I think that where Liv's comments were at substantively is where even a mainstream declaration should be in the fullness of time. But as it stands, this is where we were able to land now. And I think that it does more good than harm, though I am very open to conversation and pushback on this point. I think it can be difficult to tell when a kind of moderate incrementalist intervention that works within an unjust structure to make some progress, even if we acknowledge ultimately more transformative change is needed. I think it can be a difficult question in what circumstances that does more good by shifting the goalposts a little bit versus doing more harm by like ethics washing a fundamentally unjust practice and reinforcing a fundamentally unjust status quo. And I think it can come down to little details like, are you saying, Burger King, thanks so much for introducing a plant-based option, now all is well in the world? Or are you saying, hey, this is a nice step in the right direction, obviously much more is needed, we applaud the step taken, and we will keep pushing for the transformative changes that are actually needed, right? Or in advocacy for legal personhood and rights for non-human animals, are you saying, hey, if we can acknowledge that Happy the elephant has a bodily right to liberty, then great, we can draw the line after Happy and forget about all the farmed and wild animals, we got the elephant, her rights, and all is right in the world? Or are we saying, hey, Happy is one step towards a much broader and more difficult conversation about how to acknowledge legal rights and personhood in a truly like astonishing number of animals, and we might not have all the answers yet, we might not have solved the problem yet, but at least we took one step on that path by acknowledging legal personhood and Happy. To me, those details are what make an incrementalist intervention do good more than harm or do more harm than good. And at least in my view, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness was on the more building momentum towards further changes in the future side of that line, really emphasizing that this is a current, like at minimum, and that we can and should really push to go beyond it in the fullness of time. So yeah, broadly substantively agree. I think this is where science is headed. I hope scientists get there sooner rather than later. In the meantime, we can all keep pushing for them to get there sooner rather than later. But I will stand behind the declaration. I am proud of it. I think it does more harm than good, though I am open to
Well, you might want to rephrase that. Yeah.
more good than harm.
Given what you
Sorry.
got, yeah.
Thank you, Liv. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. I think it does more good than harm, though I'm very open to continued pushback and conversation on those points.
Sorry, Lori, do you mind if I ask Jeff a question? And this might be one of the questions.
We are going to, if we have, I mean, we have till 1:30. So
right, and this might be a question.
Dismiss your Q&A. So keep going.
Yeah, I just mean this might be a question that's been asked that I don't see.
Sure.
But in terms of the declaration, Jeff, what do you make of the fact that there have been signatories who signed it explicitly because it did not go far enough, because it limited the consciousness too. And they're on record for saying that. In fact, in the New Yorker article, I think where Jonathan Birch was interviewed. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. I acknowledge that yeah, there is a lot of disagreement and a lot of uncertainty among the signatories, and some people think others are going too far ethically, too far scientifically, and then vice versa, not going far enough ethically or scientifically. And again, I personally think that we can and should go farther, but of course that will take a lot of, further science and further
Yeah,
ethics
sorry,
and
I
education
want
and
to hear what you're
advocacy.
saying. I just want to make sure I'm clear in that
Yeah.
in the limited language, and I understand that the deliberation led to precise language, but limited language and maybe ambiguous enough that it allowed signatories to sign it because they were happy that it did not extend consciousness to certain taxonomic groups, to certain species, etc. And they're on record for saying that could be read in the limited language of the declaration.
Yeah, I disagree with people who think that broadly the status quo can and should be preserved on the substance. I am nevertheless happy that I can work with people with whom I disagree to, at the very least, find an area of overlap, an area where we can agree and where we can work together in order to inform society of, now here is the scope of disagreement. It used to be this, and now it can be this. And I really like that there can be, both in science and in advocacy or policy, that kind of openness towards coalition building, working with people across quite strong substantive disagreement so that you can find those areas of agreement, find those areas of convergence, make some progress within that, and then within the new status quo, with the slightly maybe more narrow area of disagreement, you can then keep fighting it out and keep making your arguments and sharing your information. I hope and expect that my arguments and my information will win overall, and I'm going to keep fighting that fight. But I love that people who are maybe more cautious or conservative about changing scientific practices were, in spite of that disagreement, happy to work with us to make at least this statement. I actually think that is wonderful, and I'm grateful for it.
I think, what's interesting here is, there's a lot of points of tension here and Liv, I don't know, not sure if this is even going beyond what you're saying, but there are people who have signed on to various declarations of this kind who do invasive research with animals, who do research with animals that they keep confined to concrete tanks, et cetera, where it seems that the language of the actual statement is in conflict with what they personally actually do. So, they'll say, rats and mice are conscious, and they go back to their lab and they kill them. So, we have an issue here. And I think one of the issues is the issue of idealism versus realism. And what I'm hearing here is we all want to get to the same place where we live in a world where we don't do these things to other animals, and we have a very different relationship to them. And the question is, how do we get there? One of the things is that a declaration does have a lot of weight in terms of public opinion. So I think it has to be taken very seriously that, if it can be used as a way to whitewash a lot of work, that ethically problematic work that scientists do. At the same time, it is, I have to say, how much of the problems and the tensions that we're discussing here are the declarations themselves, or how much is it just with society? So, obviously the New York Declaration says certain things about how certain animals should be treated. And we go out in society and none
But
of
does
that.
it? I'm not sure it says that, Lori. I'm not sure
Well,
the
okay,
declaration really
so
gets that treatment at all. I mean, Jeff, I really appreciate those efforts. And I know even crafting something along these lines is very difficult. It does take a lot of compromise and deliberation. But I really don't think it says anything about the ultimate treatment of animals that the Declaration is attempting to speak for, on behalf of, or consider. It stops well short of that. And I think that there's a major danger in that. And that allows for a lot of those signatories to sign on, right? The ones that explicitly do research with aversive stimuli that cause pain in these animals, that keep these animals confined, and feel continued justification to do so, right? Even if it's from a utilitarian perspective of, for the greater good, that these individuals are taking one for the team. I really don't think the Declaration is speaking to speaking to a better treatment, a better consideration for these animals. It's very welfarist in that sense. It isn't speaking to the well-being and the rich lives of these animals. So Lori, I'd like, maybe Lori, it would be good for you to maybe weigh in if you think that's true. I don't see that in the language of the Declaration.
well, I do think that, there is a lot of gray area here. I'm much more of an animal rights proponent than an incrementalist, but I do realize that we live in a world with other people who have different opinions. And then the question becomes, the fundamental question is not whether we protect other animals or respect them. Yeah, we should do all of that. It's how do you get there? And this is fundamentally perhaps a question that comes down to maybe an incrementalist approach, but it's not, it's the question is how far do you go and then lose people at the same time? So if you just come out and say, well, we shouldn't be doing this and that and the other thing, who's going to listen to that at the other, but maybe we should anyway. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, this is really the problem of, we should just come out and say what we want to say. The other thing is the role of science. What, these declarations do is they use the science to make statements, and Liv, what you do is also make statements based on science, talking about the elephants and the jumping spiders. I mean, all about that because of the science that was done with
But
those.
not all science is the same. Not all
I know
methods
that.
are the
I
same.
know that. I
Not
know
all,
that.
right? And we need to be really careful there.
I know, I agree. And Jeff knows that after I read the declaration, I wrote a blog about the fact that, you know, we should, and this is why we're having this conversation, because I'm so interested and it's so important, is we maybe don't have to do one more study with this insect species to include that species in the world of consciousness. Maybe consciousness candidates of all kinds should, I mean, it should be off limits to do anything negative, invasive, intrusive to them. Why? I mean, people talk about the fact that, consciousness studies in fish come from maybe 2 or 3 different species, but there's thousands of species of fish. So are we going to go ahead and test every single fish species in the ocean to come to some sort of conclusion about whether we should harm them or not? I don't think so. So the question is, where do you draw the line? And this is a continual problem, but I think declarations can and should go further. But I say that as the co-author of the Declaration on Rights for Cetaceans, that we wrote in Helsinki, and we spent a lot of time and we just laid it out there. And you know what? Nobody pays any attention to it. It's just sitting there. And that's an experience I've had. So yeah, we said our piece, but nobody does anything. It's never enacted or anything. Nobody pays any attention. We just put it out there aspirationally, and that's it. So there are issues here about how we get things done. So without going on any further, let me turn to some of the questions that people have. One of the questions here is, were the scientists, well, I think, Jeff, you've answered this. Were the scientists generally in agreement that the wording in the declaration could have been stronger, but that stronger language wouldn't be accepted or adopted by the non-scientific community? So or is the declaration representing the strongest language the scientists could agree or endorse?
Yeah, I would say that the goal was to find language that both ethically and scientifically the lead authors and signatories could all endorse and sign and stand behind. And since there was enough diversity in that cohort of people crafting the language, I then hoped that it might reflect broader agreement in society and different academic fields, even though people will have disagreement about how exactly to interpret the details and what exactly to call for next and so on. But in the first instance, we were trying to seek agreement among ourselves about what we could all endorse, notwithstanding any disagreements we might have about the science and about the ethics.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question by one of your co-authors, Liv, on that piece. William Lynn, I hope he doesn't mind my saying, and he asks, please say more specifically about reversing the burden of proof in researching animal consciousness. What does that mean, and how could it change science and policy? Good question.
I'm happy to speak to that. Liv,
Yeah, go for
would
it.
you like?
Yeah, and then Liv.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I actually think this is a really important suggestion, and actually one of the other lead authors of or organizers of the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, Kristen Andrews, has argued specifically for this in recent published work. So she argues for flipping the default hypothesis to all animals are conscious from the current sort of status quo of presuming non-consciousness. And of course, you can argue for that on ethical grounds, because it would be much worse to accidentally treat a subject like an object than it would be to accidentally treat an object like a subject. And so ethically, when in doubt, perhaps we should err on the side of caution and err on the side of attributing consciousness in order to mitigate risks we might accidentally be imposing on conscious beings. Though Kristen notes that there is also a scientific rationale for reversing the default assumption. She thinks that when you assume consciousness, that leads to better, more rigorous, and more productive hypotheses, where you can then go test ethically, non-invasively, but you can make hypotheses and then collect observations that explore different dimensions of consciousness across species on the assumption that consciousness is there in the first place. And her view is that not only would the assumption of consciousness be better ethically because it allows you to err on the side of caution when in doubt, but it would also be better scientifically for that reason. It leads to better, more rigorous, more productive hypotheses. I think that is plausible. I do think it raises interesting and challenging questions about how exactly you would operationalize that. Like, for example, would you be now assuming consciousness for all animals by default, but not necessarily all living beings? Would you be assuming consciousness for all animals by default, but not like cognitively similar AI systems? So exactly how far are you going to go in the world of different types of beings with different types of cognitive systems if you do flip it and presume consciousness until proven or demonstrated otherwise? But I personally do like this proposal and think some version of it is correct and should be accepted. I wish it could have been reflected in the declaration, but we were not able to go that far in this case. And I would love to just think together with people about how to get those details right, both from an ethical perspective and from a scientific perspective.
Thank you. And I'll turn it to Liv, but just to say, to be fair, I mean, Kristen has called for more research on candidates. And if you're going to flip everything and assume everyone's conscious, why? Why do more research? So to me, there's a major flaw in what she's arguing. You're either going to make the assumption and go on with your life, or you're going to make the assumption and then force all the animals to prove that that assumption is wrong or right. So I think that a call for more research when you're already making an assumption is problematic. And I also think that a call for more research can result in more invasive, harmful research unless you're very careful about how you articulate that. But I'll.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Lori, because you predicted part of my comments, and I think that would actually be perhaps even a more interesting conversation. Maybe should have preceded what led to the declaration. As I see it, is talking about the reversal of the burden of proof, and what that entails. Because I, like you, Lori, think that it will largely just lead to different candidates, different permissions around research, more of the same types of research, maybe rebranded in certain ways. But I think that debate, that discussion, that conversation about what it would really mean to reverse the burden of proof beyond an academic debate, but what does that mean for our approach to science, the linking between science and ethics? What does that mean for animal consciousness research? I think that would be really probative and important. And yeah, I'd be happy to be part of that conversation. But that would mean really there'd have to be an understanding that this means really challenging the status quo of science as it's been, which is, it's anthropocentric, right? Science is focused on our interest, our values, our conveniences, even animal consciousness research, right? In many ways, it translates to improvements, maybe oftentimes in a welfarist approach for other animals, but it is largely anthropocentric, right? Even the call for more research, right, is anthropocentric. And I think not enough researchers themselves are reckoning with that, with their own biases in their own research and in the very questions that they ask, and even reckoning with who they're doing the research for, right? Truly asking that questions of themselves. I'm not sure there's that much honesty among the researchers who do this kind of work.
Yeah, if I could just briefly respond on behalf of Kristen. I mean, eventually Kristen can join this webinar perhaps and speak to her views more directly. But I just want to note that at least when the three of us together have called for more research, we have called for that research to also have a particular character, to be non-invasive, to not inflict pain and suffering on animals, but rather to be observational research, or again, examining animals for behavioral evidence of joy and pleasure.
But have you
and
defined
so on.
observational? Is it still keeping animals in captivity? Have you talked about suffering, the psychological suffering?
I hear you. I agree that there is not maximum detail in every statement made about these issues, and so there is still openness to interpretation, and then there can be more conservative interpretations that are compatible with ongoing laboratory research. Those are just inevitable risks involved with doing public communications of any kind.
Sure.
But yes, no, we have added at least those caveats that I just mentioned, and I think there is value, and it has given us a platform to make exactly those points. There was a Scientific American interview with me today that is specifically about the value of switching from pain to joy. That interview would not have happened without the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. So that is just to say, Kristen is at least there, and then I think that there can be more conversation about where to go beyond that. More to say in response to what you were saying beyond that, but I can stop there so we can make sure that we can get some more questions.
Oh, let me just, I don't want to challenge that there's been a lot of media coverage of the Declaration, but I do want to push back a little bit about what you just said, Jeff, about that the conversation about switching from pain to joy would not have happened. That conversation's been had for a long time, well before this Declaration came out.
Oh, I just
No, no,
meant
no.
that interview would not have
Right,
happened.
that's fine. But I mean,
Not
that
a
conversation about the possibility, but even in the discussion around positive emotions, affective states, positive
sure.
emotional balances for animals, um, well documented, long documented, and
Yeah, of
yet,
course.
right? And yet
Mhm.
we continue to exploit them, harm them, keep them in captivity that deprives them of their lives, of their autonomy, of their agency. And so this isn't to undermine or challenge your beliefs and what you're pushing for, Jeff, but I am pushing back against what I believe is ultimately complacency in declarations like these that ultimately keep the bar quite low and allow for the status quo to continue because it continues to give voice to the status quo rather than really raising that bar, right? Even if it means some people don't sign that declaration, even if then drop out, don't sign it. Other people will step in to sign it. Maybe people who don't have such a name, but that's okay. And I feel like there's a bit of pandering that goes on to allow for the mainstream, the quote unquote mainstream. And I'll challenge, and I wonder even if this mainstream is the mainstream. They're just a sector of society that is given a voice. And I sometimes think the compromises that come from declarations that like these perpetuate the volume given to that sector of society when there are greater numbers outside of that status quo, outside of that quote unquote mainstream.
Yeah, we are unfortunately in such a bad status quo with respect to treatment of animals and control over animals that a declaration like this can at one and the same time constitute a very significant shifting of the baseline and still be broadly compatible with an unjust status quo. So both of those can be true. The fact that the declaration includes insects, for example, within its scope is a monumental shift in terms of both the number and diversity of animals for whom we have a responsibility to consider welfare risks. And yet, as you say, the language is broad enough to encompass many different views, including quite status quo biased views about what it takes to extend them like reasonable, proportionate, appropriate consideration. I just think those can both be true at the same time. And that is just symbolic of how far we have to go on this issue. But I do still think that there is room in a broader division of labor for these moderate incrementalist interventions with alongside these other more radical sort of like challenging interventions. And I think that just exposes exactly the kinds of tensions in society and in science that you are describing, and exposing those tensions is a really good first step towards eventually addressing them and resolving them. But that just is a
Right.
process that
But
takes time.
even using the word sort of more moderate, more
Hmm.
mainstream, more radical, I
Hmm.
sort of object to because again, it's reifying that division that isn't always necessarily reflective of true opinion out there in society. And so again, to my point, it continues to give voice, to give volume to that power structure, right? And even the use of like the phrase like so anyway, so and I think that needs to be interrogated. And why to me, that is more reason to be more bold in these declarations. That here's an opportunity to be more bold, not more radical, but actually more reflective of, I think, a greater part of society that cares, truly cares for animals and the treatment of animals than is actually reflected in this fairly weak declaration. And I'm all like, even your use of the term like welfare risks concerns
Mhm.
me. Like, what do we mean by welfare risks when we're talking about extending the moral circle, right, to include insects, right? Does this mean we're going to farm them more kindly towards killing them? Like, what does that mean? And so is it ultimately the same treatment as we do pigs and other animals in the, for farmed animals? Like, so what is welfare risk? And that's why I'm really clear. As someone who has a PhD in animal welfare science, along with animal behavior, and conservation biology, I don't use welfare anymore. I really talk about the well-being
I don't
of
know
animals.
if Liv and Jeff, you've frozen. Okay, you're back.
Yeah, sorry. Were you able to at least
Yeah.
hear me, or was I just talking to myself?
Yeah. No, no, no. I did hear you. I think, Lori, actually you were frozen, but at least from my end, I was able to see and hear
Okay,
Liv the
okay,
entire
good,
time. Mhm.
good.
Jeff, let me just say, I don't want to be like, feel like I'm attacking you. I want to really elevate the conversation so that um to use this space to talk about like how to get to even where you, separate from the declaration, right, think we should be, right? And that's
Mhm.
why I'm using this moment to sort of push back
Yeah.
on certain language.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I am certainly open to pushback about particular types of framings like mainstream or moderate, as opposed to other ways of talking about what we might take to be a certain snapshot of a certain subset of science, as well as radical, where you might think bold would be a better choice, and pushing even so-called moderate interventions to be a little bit more bold. I actually think that there is space for doing that. Sometimes people are too cautious and too conservative, and then they rationalize it by saying, "Oh, my role is to be the moderate one," when in fact they could have played that role while still being a little bit bolder and pushing things a little bit farther. It might just be that in this case we have disagreement on the facts about how bold this declaration could have been pushed, how far this declaration could have gone, while still holding on to enough of the people so that it could play roughly the role we had in mind, as opposed to gradually transforming into the kind of declaration that Lori described working on, which, to be clear, I think is also really valuable, but is playing a different role in the conversation. And I think these types of interventions should stand alongside each other. My perception was that if we pushed much farther, it would have become that other type of declaration with different types of signatories and a different kind of message. And that is valuable, but that also exists and can exist independently of this collection of people. And we thought it was valuable to do what we could do with this collection of people as a complementary effort. I think we went about as far as we could, and just uh, appropriately captured the consensus compromise view among those individuals, for better and for worse, as a representation of where we are, and that has some good features and some bad features. But again, I think those are the types of issues where you really are getting into the details and figuring out, is this appropriately playing the kind of role that a, relatively speaking, mainstream or moderate, or whatever term you want to use, intervention should play. And I think reasonable people can disagree there.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we are having this conversation embedded in a world where no matter what scientists say or do, or what signatories say or do, we are still so far from having a respectful relationship with the other animals. It isn't even funny. I mean, we
Yeah.
know that farmed animals are conscious, sentient beings. We're doing more, we're farming them more. We're doing more and more manipulative, invasive genetic research with them. Nothing seems to stop us. So, this conversation is so important, but at the end of the day, we have to think about the fact that we are living in a world where I don't think most people are willing to make any changes for other animals. Maybe a few, but I mean, again, the questions here is really about that. Beyond ending animal agriculture and experimentation, and those are tall orders, what kinds of changes in society would be necessary to recognize and respect non-human consciousness? So does it mean we don't drive cars anymore because we know we kill insects when we drive cars? How does this play out in reality, knowing that we could talk about insects and we should, and there, in my view, we should do everything to respect and protect them. But we don't even do that with the animals that we have a mountain of evidence for, that we're doing harm and they're sentient beings. So what do we, I mean, part of this has to be about what are the right tools to make the change in society.
I don't know if Kathy actually wants to come back in, especially since we're as part of a animal law program, to talk about the role of law in all of this and policy.
Thank you. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I have actually been thinking that the context really matters, right? So coming back to what Lori just said about the tool and putting together a lot of what you guys have said. So the law is a very pragmatic space, right? So it's like, these are the cases we have, these are the statutes we have, these are the courts we have, these are the legislative frameworks we have. And so within that, I think Jeff's sort of conceptualization, right, of the Declaration ends up being really meaningful, because we can say there are people with status, because it does matter in the courts, who are saying things that we can submit and rely on as evidence to support the arguments that we want to make on behalf of animals. And so that's a really discrete use of data, right? And because of the limitations in the legal setting, right? So, and that's also one way of approaching the legal setting. So other people might want to say, no, we want to make really strong arguments for which there isn't already precedent or there isn't already scientific consensus. And then that's a different legal strategy, right? That they can do that. But if we're talking about a sort of traditional legal approach within a litigation kind of setting, or even trying to get legislative change, right? These are the kind of tools that we tend to look for using. And so there's sort of the philosophical and moral arguments that stand outside of, to some degree, right, the legal arguments. And so they're positioned differently. Having said that, there's also the desire not to have any legal strategy lock in, right, and continue to reify the property status of animals and the objectification and all of those kinds of things. And so that's the challenge that I think we end up facing in the legal context all the time, right? So what compromises are we willing to make in this context, in this setting, because we think the risk of winning or losing, right, is greater or lesser using this strategy, right? And so it's all very, in a way, transactional in an unfortunate way. But that is the reality of the confines of
Can I ask you a question, Kathy? Sorry if you're still
No, go ahead.
finishing up. So thinking about what defines an animal, at least in the United States, right, under the Animal Welfare Act, especially if we're essentially disregarding all the body of evidence, the scientific consensus around consciousness, cognition, right, all of those things, because most of the animals, particularly because they're farmed for food, aren't or used for research, don't count as an animal, right? So it contravenes all of that evidence. So what then would you say, right, for declarations like this that are trying to expand that inclusion, right, to taxonomic groups like invertebrates that have an eye to US law, right? or potential changes that we progress in US law where, you know, if we were to have it differently, what would you want included to help the space of law and policy, right, anticipate things moving forward?
Yeah, so obviously the more the better, right? The more signatories, the more science, the more and those work in opposite directions, right? Because we're going to have more people willing to sign on to a narrower statement, right? And I think I should also articulate that there are times when we want to challenge the restrictions that are inherent in the law, right? So we want to say this limitation in the Animal Welfare Act that excludes most animals that are used in that setting is ridiculous. It's not scientific. And so that would be a different kind of strategic approach, and we'd want different tools for that approach. Does that making sense? Right? As opposed to we accept that these are the confines we're working within, right? And given that, what can we do to expand from within, right? Not attacking from without, but from within that system, using it. How can we improve the lives of the animals? How can we improve the categories of animals who are included in consideration? And so those are really different strategies. And so we would want different kinds of information. But yeah, the more scientific consensus ends up being really important as a construct in legal strategy, right?
Because of precedent. But
no,
what about
no, it's not really because of precedent. It's because the judges don't know what to do with this information, and nor do legislatures. So they're like, we're not experts in this. So you're going to have to tell us there's enough agreement in the expert community that we can change something that has been accepted, right? Because you're asking us to change the status quo. So you're going to have to give us enough evidence to tell us that
I'm sorry, yeah, I meant precedent based on what's considered what's historically been included in that body of evidence. That's what I mean, right? And so thinking more creatively about the body of evidence.
Yeah, and I know there's only 2 minutes, so let me stop talking and let Lori take it back.
Well, this is the start of something, not the end of something. This is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, how do we make a different world for other animals? Because we're not doing very well right now. And we're all trying. So we just got to keep trying. I really appreciate all the work that Jeff, Kristen, Jonathan put into creating the New York Declaration. Very much so. I appreciate Liv's point of view as well. And I think that, and your ability to articulate where we might be able to go further and where maybe we should. But, and then Kathy bringing this to the fact that we, what the law requires and how the law uses all of this evidence and how far we can actually go in the law. All of this is really important. I really want to continue this conversation because it is a critically important one. And thank everyone for your questions. And we can do another one and expand it. I'd love to have Kristen. I'd love, this is important. Kathy and I have another live webinar coming your way. This one's going to be a barn burner too. Be on de-extinction. And the title is, how can we make de-extinction extinct? So I think you know where we're going to be coming from. And, I think that I hope all of you look forward to that. Thank you again for our guests from both Kathy and I. Thank you, Liv.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.